In the unforgiving expanse of the West, where piety was a whispered insult and character was forged in the crucible of violence, Jedediah Lowell had learned to measure worth by the weight of a bullet and the suffocating silence of unexpressed dreams. His world was a stark landscape of arid plains and hardened hearts, a place where survival demanded a constant vigilance, a readiness to defend what little was possessed against any perceived threat. His ranch, a testament to his father's relentless toil and his own stoic endurance, was more than just land. It was a fortress against the encroaching wilderness and the shadowed figures that haunted its fringes. The ingrained wisdom of his upbringing, echoing the pronouncements of men who saw compassion as a fatal flaw, had built an unbreachable fence around his spirit, a rigid ideology that dictated a clear division between us and them. Justice, in his eyes, was a matter of territorial integrity, of maintaining the hard-won boundaries against those who dwelled beyond the pale. The harsh realities of his environment had instilled in him a profound skepticism, a belief that vulnerability was an invitation to ruin and that the only true strength lay in an unwavering, unyielding defense. He had internalized the lessons of a land that offered little and demanded much, a land where every resource was fiercely guarded and every interaction was a potential negotiation of power. This was the bedrock of his existence, the unassailable truth that guided his every action, shaping him into a man who understood the language of fences and the stark finality of exclusion. The rhythm of Jed's life was dictated by the seasons, by the relentless demands of the land, and by the unspoken anxieties that clung to the air like dust. The corn harvest, a time of anxious anticipation and communal effort, was usually a period of quiet, if tense, observation. But this year, the familiar landscape of his routine was irrevocably altered by a chance encounter that would unravel the tightly woven fabric of his convictions. He saw him first as a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a gaunt silhouette against the setting sun, a boy, no older than 17, as thin and brittle as a sun-baked twig, his eyes holding the desperate, hunted look of an animal caught in the open. This was no ordinary trespasser. This was one of the elk shadows, a tribe relegated to whispers and fear, a people who had seemingly vanished when the iron serpent of the railroad had scarred their ancestral lands, cleaving the valley into two irreconcilable halves. The boy's transgression was simple, born of desperation. He was stealing ears of corn, a furtive act of survival. Yet something in his posture, in the way he fell to his knees as Jed approached, his hands raised not in defiance, but in a chilling tableau of surrender, stopped Jed in his tracks. It was a gesture that spoke of a profound, ingrained understanding of power dynamics, a silent acknowledgement of his own precarious position. This wasn't the look of a thief. It was the look of someone expecting the finality of a bullet, not the unexpected grace of clemency. And in that suspended moment, as the boy's plea hung unspoken in the twilight air, a foreign sensation stirred within Jed, a crack forming in the edifice of his hardened beliefs. Instead of the expected confrontation, the call to the sheriff, the swift assertion of authority, Jed found himself offering a simple act of sustenance. He gave the boy bread and water, a gesture so alien to his ingrained pragmatism that it felt almost involuntary. He told the boy to leave, his voice rough with an unfamiliar hesitation, a quiet dismissal that carried the weight of an unspoken question. It was an act of minimal engagement, a mere ripple in the placid surface of his world, yet it was the planting of a seed, a tiny, almost imperceptible disruption that would, in time, blossom into a profound and irreversible transformation. Back in the familiar, boisterous confines of the town tavern, the whispers began, morphing into derisive laughter. "Jed Lowell, Good Samaritan to the savages!" they jeered, their voices laced with contempt. He was branded a fool, a weakling. his act of basic human decency interpreted as a betrayal of their shared identity. Even Mara, his neighbor, a woman whose own life was a testament to the prevailing stoicism, spat on the floor, her pronouncement a chilling prophecy. One day they'll come back, and it won't be on bended knee. Jed endured their scorn, the biting wind outside mirroring the icy reception of his actions. He slept that night to the echo of their laughter, unaware that the earth, in its silent, ancient wisdom, was already weaving a secret, a promise of a dawn that would illuminate truths far more profound than any he had ever known. The seemingly insignificant act of sharing sustenance had, unbeknownst to him, set in motion a chain of events that would redefine his understanding of justice, mercy, and the very essence of his own humanity, pulling him inexorably towards a destiny he could never have foreseen. The first significant tremor in Jed's carefully constructed world arrived with the dawn. The preternatural silence that preceded the sun's ascent was shattered not by the familiar sounds of his ranch waking to a new day, but by a low, resonant hum, a collective presence that drew him out of his house with a rifle in hand. He stepped onto the porch, his senses on high alert, expecting a threat, an ambush. What he saw, however, arrested his breath and silenced the primal fear that had been his constant companion. 50 figures, a silent, unmoving testament to a shared resolve, knelt on the dew-kissed earth before his door. Men, women, and children, their faces etched with a quiet dignity, their bodies angled in an attitude of profound respect. The boy from the previous evening stood at their center, a silent sentinel. Then he placed something on the ground, a small, unassuming object that, in that moment, held the weight of an entire history. It was a piece of cloth, worn and faded, upon which his name, Jedediah Lowell, was starkly inscribed in a deep crimson hue. It was not a declaration of war, but a profound acknowledgement, a recognition that transcended language. Jed couldn't decipher the unspoken words that hung in the air, but he understood the gesture, the profound humility and shared experience it represented. For the first time in years, standing before this silent assembly, a wave of shame washed over him, a deep, visceral regret for the ranch he had so fiercely defended, a defense that now seemed hollow and misplaced in the face of such unyielding grace. The significance of the cloth deepened when Jed, his mind still reeling from the spectacle, examined it more closely. It was fashioned from flour sacking, familiar material from his own barn, yet it was old, worn thin by time and use. A chilling realization dawned. It was the very same kind of sack his father had used. The winter, a desperate, hungry tribe had appeared at their doorstep, only to be driven away with harsh words and a slammed door. Jed, a boy then, remembered the profound silence of the snow that had soon after erased any trace of their desperate footprints. This cloth, returned to him now, was not merely a symbol of his own act of mercy, but a tangible link to a past transgression, a stark reminder that his compassion was not a novel invention, but a belated act of reparation for a historical injustice. It was a returned souvenir, a silent testament to the cyclical nature of suffering and the enduring power of shared humanity. The weight of his father's unforgiving stance, the ingrained belief that such encounters were to be met with absolute rejection, began to feel like a burden, a legacy of fear that was no longer his own to carry. The past, it seemed, was not a finished chapter, but a living entity, capable of reaching across generations to demand a reckoning, and Jed found himself unexpectedly, irrevocably, on the cusp of answering that call. The second pivotal moment arrived, not with a public spectacle, but in the quiet solitude of his own home, within the confines of a dusty, forgotten trunk. Hidden amongst his mother's belongings, Jed discovered a letter, its paper brittle with age, dated from that same harsh winter his father had turned away the hungry tribe. His mother, a woman of quiet strength and profound intuition, a stark contrast to his father's rigid pragmatism, had penned words that resonated with a wisdom that transcended the immediate circumstances. "Jed," she had written, her hand steady on the page, "if one day they come back, kneel down too. You'll understand that mercy isn't about them, it's about us." Her words were a revelation, a gentle unraveling of the rigid doctrines he had inherited. She spoke of mercy not as an act of charity towards others, but as an internal necessity, a balm for the soul, a means of reclaiming a lost part of themselves. She, who had always carried a deeper sadness than his father, had understood the true cost of a closed heart. Her quiet wisdom, her prescient understanding of a future encounter, served as a profound counterpoint to the prevailing narratives of the West, suggesting that true strength lay not in the hardness of one's defenses, but in the resilience of one's spirit, in the willingness to embrace a shared vulnerability. The second major turning point, however, arrived with the chilling echo of that very warning. The drought, a relentless specter that had plagued the surrounding towns, finally tightened its grip on their own community. The townsfolk, their faces gaunt with thirst and desperation, their wells long since run dry, turned their eyes towards Jed's ranch, their desperate plea a stark reflection of the very desperation he had witnessed in the elk shadows. They came with torches, their fear a palpable force, their demand for water fueled by a primal need. The sheriff, a man steeped in the town's ingrained fear and suspicion, presented Jed with an ultimatum: either drive the elk shadows away, the tribe that had sought refuge and shared their scarce resources, or face the complete forfeiture of his ranch, his livelihood, everything he had ever known. It was a choice designed to shatter his newfound convictions, to force him back into the familiar mold of self-preservation. But as Jed stood at the threshold of his ranch, observing the boy Naya tenderly holding the hand of an elderly woman, her frail body trembling with exhaustion, something within him irrevocably shifted. The carefully constructed fence of his beliefs, the rigid ideology that had defined his life, finally crumbled. He saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own mother's quiet courage, a continuation of her own act of profound empathy. In that moment, he understood that to uphold the values he had begun to embrace, he would have to sacrifice everything that he believed defined him: his reputation as a strong, unyielding man, the respect he had so carefully cultivated, the very security of his ranch. He made his choice, not with a bullet, but with an act of profound defiance. He closed the town's gate, severing himself from their fear-driven collective, and opened his own, offering sanctuary. They stayed, a testament to the quiet power of a chosen path. The shared meal, the communal water, the simple act of welcome mirrored the very gesture that had first pierced Jed's hardened heart, and the same gesture that had ultimately cost his mother her life. He understood then that mercy was not weakness. It was the most arduous, the most courageous act of all, the deliberate choice to give when the world's instinct was only to take. The third turning point, the defining moment that solidified the profound metamorphosis Jed had undergone, arrived months later, under the stark, unforgiving gaze of a winter sky. Naya, the boy who had first breached the walls of Jed's isolation, led him to the far end of the valley, to a place where a single ancient tree stood sentinel, its branches skeletal against the snow-laden horizon. There, with his bare hands, Naya began to dig into the frozen earth. He unearthed a small, worn amulet, its surface smooth with the touch of countless hands. As Jed took it, a wave of recognition, sharp and poignant, washed over him. It was his mother's. His father had told him she had been lost in a blizzard, venturing out that snowy night to sneak food to a neighboring farm, a solitary act of kindness that had led to her demise. But Naya's whispered words offered a different truth, a more profound narrative of her final moments. He spoke not of a solitary act of charity, but of a courageous stand, of her kneeling among the elk shadows, her body a shield, her spirit a testament to an unwavering commitment to protect them. They had buried her as one of their own, a sister, a protector. The old cloth, he revealed, was hers, a tangible link to her sacrifice. Jed's act of mercy, he realized with a clarity that brought tears to his eyes, was not merely a redemption for the Lowell family, for the sins of his father and the harshness he had inherited. It was a continuation, a living echo of his mother's ultimate sacrifice, the testament of a woman who had dared to love beyond the arbitrary lines drawn by fences and fear. The final crucial event that cemented the town's transformation and Jed's own profound shift in perspective occurred when the drought, having ravaged the surrounding communities, finally broke the spirit of their own town. Their wells were empty, their crops withered, and their hope had all but evaporated. They came to Jed's ranch, not with the torches and fear of before, but with the hollowed eyes of utter defeat, their plea for help, a silent admission of their own profound failure. And they were welcomed, not with the guarded suspicion they had shown the elk shadows, but with the same open hands, the same shared bread and water that Jed had first offered to Naya. It was the same gesture his mother had made, the same act of profound generosity that had ultimately cost her her life. In witnessing this reciprocal act of kindness, this mirroring of compassion, Jed finally understood the true nature of mercy. It was not a sign of weakness, not a concession to sentimentality, but the most difficult, the most courageous act one could undertake. The conscious, deliberate choice to give, to share, to connect, when the prevailing instinct of the world was to hoard, to isolate, to take. It was an act that defied logic, that transcended self-preservation, and in its very difficulty lay its immense power. Today, as the wind whispers through the impossibly tall stalks of corn that now sway across the valley, Jed Lowell hears two voices intertwined, a symphony of enduring wisdom. One is his mother's, her voice soft as falling snow, reminding him that forgiveness, like water in parched earth, is the fertile soil from which true growth emerges. The other is Naya's, a steady, grounding presence, a reminder that kneeling is not an act of surrender, but the act of planting deep roots, of anchoring oneself in shared humanity. Every time Jed's gaze falls upon the old cloth, now hanging as a symbol of remembrance on his door, he is transported back to a time when his own act of mercy was met with ridicule, when his perceived weakness was a source of public shame. Yet it was that very act, born of a quiet defiance and a burgeoning understanding of a deeper truth, that had ultimately saved him, saved his ranch, and saved a community from the precipice of despair. The West may have taught him that piety was weakness, but he had learned, through the quiet strength of his mother, the resilience of the elk shadows, and the unwavering hope of a boy named Naya, that true strength lay not in the hardness of one's heart, but in the courage to open it, to share what little one had, and to believe, against all odds, in the fertile promise of a shared dawn. The true test of Jed's transformation lay not in his initial act of defiance against the town's decree, but in the sustained commitment he demonstrated when the immediate crisis of thirst subsided and the lingering specter of distrust remained. Consider how this applies when you face the aftermath of a significant change. The initial surge of courage often wanes, replaced by the insidious creep of doubt and the persistent whispers of old habits. For Jed, this manifested in the subtle yet pervasive resistance from his own community. While they had accepted his sanctuary, the underlying animosity towards the elk shadows hadn't vanished. Neighbors who had once mocked him now offered strained smiles and veiled criticisms, their words laced with the unspoken accusation that his newfound compassion was a dangerous indulgence, a crack in the foundation of their shared identity. The burden of integrating two disparate cultures, each with its own deeply ingrained traditions and historical grievances, proved far more arduous than the singular act of opening his gates. It necessitated a daily, conscious effort to bridge the chasm of misunderstanding, to actively cultivate empathy where suspicion had long taken root. Furthermore, the practical implications of this integration demanded Jed's constant ingenuity. Sharing resources, particularly in the lean years that followed the initial drought, required a delicate balance. The elk shadows, with their ancestral knowledge of dryland farming and their understanding of the land's subtle rhythms, began to introduce methods that were entirely foreign to Jed's father's generation. These were not simply new techniques. They were a philosophical shift in how one interacted with the earth. For instance, the practice of water harvesting, the intricate construction of swales and contour planting to capture every precious drop of rainfall, stood in stark contrast to the old methods of reliance on deep, often depleted wells. The initial skepticism Jed felt towards these unfamiliar practices was palpable, a residual echo of his ingrained skepticism. He witnessed firsthand how these new approaches required not just physical labor, but a profound mental recalibration, a willingness to unlearn generations of ingrained assumptions about how the land should be worked. Building on this, however, the deeper challenge lay in the economic interdependence that naturally arose. The elk shadow's ancient seeds, remarkably resilient and adapted to the harsh climate, began to yield crops where Jed's conventional methods had faltered. This success, while a boon, also created an uncomfortable dependency. The townspeople, accustomed to their own established trade routes and agricultural practices, found themselves reliant on the very people they had once ostracized. This economic reliance, though beneficial in the long run, fostered a subtle resentment, a feeling of diminished autonomy that Jed had to navigate with extreme tact. He found himself mediating disputes over land use, brokering agreements on crop sharing, and tirelessly working to demonstrate the tangible benefits of their shared existence, often in the face of persistent, unspoken resistance. This wasn't about grand gestures anymore. It was about the quiet, consistent application of empathy in the face of ingrained prejudice. Conversely, the indigenous knowledge brought by the elk shadows extended beyond agriculture. Their understanding of medicinal plants, for example, offered a potent alternative to the town's reliance on imported, often expensive, remedies. Jed observed how the elders would gather specific herbs during precise lunar cycles, preparing poultices and teas that proved remarkably effective in treating common ailments. This not only improved the general health of the community, but also fostered a deep respect for a wisdom that had been systematically undervalued. It highlighted how the suppression of indigenous knowledge, often a consequence of conquest and displacement, represented a profound loss not just for the people themselves, but for the broader human tapestry, a loss of practical solutions and a deeper connection to the natural world. Another crucial layer to this ongoing integration was the subtle shift in the children's perceptions. Jed noticed how the younger generation, less burdened by the historical animosities of their parents, readily embraced the new reality. They played together, learned together, and shared stories without the filter of prejudice. The children of the town, exposed to the elk shadows' songs, their games, and their unique understanding of the wilderness, began to see the world through a broader lens. This intergenerational exchange, this natural budding of understanding, offered Jed a glimmer of enduring hope, a testament to the fact that while ingrained biases could be deeply entrenched, the innocence of youth possessed an innate capacity for acceptance and a powerful ability to forge new connections. It was in these quiet interactions, these shared moments of learning and play, that the true seeds of lasting reconciliation began to take root, nurtured by Jed's unwavering day-to-day commitment. The enduring challenge Jed faced was the meticulous reconstruction of a shared legal and social framework, one that could acknowledge and integrate the distinct customs of both the Lowell Ranch and the Elk Shadow tribe. This wasn't merely about amending existing ordinances, it was about forging entirely new paradigms for property rights, resource allocation, and dispute resolution, recognizing that the old Western legal structures, built on principles of individual ownership and territorial exclusion, were fundamentally incompatible with the communal ethos that now defined his expanded domain. Consider how this applies when you are tasked with creating equitable systems in environments where established norms clash with emergent needs. The process involved countless hours poring over dusty legal texts, attempting to find common ground between statutes designed for a singular culture and the nuanced, unwritten laws that had governed the Elk Shadows for centuries. The very notion of land tenure, for instance, had to be re-envisioned. For the Lowells, it was about deeds and boundaries, a tangible claim to ownership. For the Elk Shadows, it was a sacred trust, a living entity to be respected and utilized sustainably, with rights and responsibilities flowing through kinship and communal agreement, not through inked parchment. Furthermore, the practical administration of justice presented a unique dilemma. The traditional methods of the West, often swift and punitive, were ill-suited to the restorative principles that the Elk Shadows favored. Now consider how this applies when you must mediate conflicts arising from deeply ingrained, yet opposing, cultural approaches to accountability. Jed found himself acting as an unlikely arbiter, translating not just words but entire worldviews. A dispute over grazing rights, for example, which in the old days might have been settled with a swift eviction or a show of force, now required Jed to facilitate discussions where elders from both groups articulated their needs and concerns. He had to learn to recognize the symbolic significance of certain water sources or migration paths, understanding that these were not mere points on a map, but integral elements of a cultural narrative, imbued with ancestral meaning. This required a deep dive into the oral histories of the Elk Shadows, a process that demanded immense patience and a genuine willingness to learn, to set aside his own ingrained assumptions about how disputes should be handled. Building on this, however, the economic implications of this new legal landscape demanded an equally innovative approach. The established system of credit and trade, designed for individual ranchers operating within a Western economic model, had to be adapted to accommodate the Elk Shadows' more fluid, gift-based economy. Now, consider how this applies when integrating disparate economic systems without undermining the foundational principles of either. Jed had to devise mechanisms for fair exchange, for valuing resources and labor in a way that respected both the market-driven realities of the surrounding territories and the reciprocal obligations that formed the backbone of the Elk Shadows' social fabric. This meant establishing a communal storehouse, not just for surplus grain, but for shared tools and resources, managed by a council that included representatives from both communities. It was a testament to his evolving understanding that true prosperity was not measured solely by individual accumulation, but by the collective well-being and the equitable distribution of shared abundance. Conversely, the intangible, yet profoundly important aspect of cultural preservation demanded Jed's careful attention. The Elk Shadows possessed a rich heritage of storytelling, of intricate beadwork, and of ceremonial practices deeply connected to the land's cycles. Now consider how this applies when safeguarding traditions that are threatened by dominant cultural pressures. Jed recognized that the survival of these cultural markers was as vital to the community's resilience as any material resource. He actively supported the elders in teaching their crafts and traditions to the younger generations, creating spaces where these practices could flourish without the stigma of being perceived as primitive or outdated. He understood that by valuing and integrating these cultural elements, he was not merely preserving history, he was enriching the present and laying the foundation for a more vibrant, multifaceted future. This active engagement in cultural preservation was a far cry from his former self, the man who had viewed anything outside his narrow definition of Western civilization with suspicion and disdain. The ongoing integration also necessitated a profound re-evaluation of the ranch's operational infrastructure, moving beyond mere legal frameworks to tangible physical adaptations. Now consider how this applies when you must physically reconfigure established systems to accommodate new populations or functions. The existing barns, designed for Jed's father's limited herd and seasonal work, were insufficient to house the combined population, particularly during the harsh winter months. This prompted a significant expansion, a merging of architectural styles that reflected the union of two distinct ways of life. New living quarters were constructed, not simply appended, but thoughtfully designed to incorporate elements of both Western practicality and the Elk Shadow's preference for communal gathering spaces, often featuring central hearths and open-plan layouts that encouraged interaction. Furthermore, the irrigation systems, originally conceived for single-crop agriculture, had to be radically redesigned to support the diverse needs of the Elk Shadow's traditional crops, which often required specialized water management techniques. This involved the meticulous planning and construction of a more intricate network of channels and reservoirs, a testament to the shared effort required to sustain a larger, more diverse community. Building on this, however, the agricultural practices themselves underwent a significant evolution, moving beyond mere crop diversity to encompass a holistic approach to land stewardship. Now, consider how this applies when you must transition from extractive farming to regenerative practices that foster ecological balance. The Elk Shadows introduced methods such as companion planting, where different species were cultivated together to mutually benefit each other, deterring pests, enriching the soil, and optimizing nutrient uptake. This was a stark departure from the Lowell tradition of monoculture, which, while efficient in the short term, had gradually depleted the soil's vitality. Jed witnessed firsthand how intercropping corn with beans and squash, a practice known as the Three Sisters, not only provided a balanced diet, but also enhanced soil fertility through nitrogen fixation. This agricultural symbiosis represented a fundamental shift in perspective, viewing the land not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner to be nurtured. Consequently, the economic ecosystem of the ranch began to diversify beyond agricultural output. Now consider how this applies when you must develop new revenue streams that leverage the unique skills and resources of an integrated community. The Elk Shadows possessed an intimate knowledge of the surrounding wilderness, identifying and harvesting medicinal plants, crafting intricate tools from bone and sinew, and possessing an uncanny ability to track game with minimal disturbance. Jed facilitated the establishment of small cottage industries, capitalizing on these skills. He helped organize expeditions for medicinal herb gathering, ensuring fair compensation for the harvesters, and establishing connections with apothecaries in distant towns who valued the purity and potency of these natural remedies. Furthermore, the sale of finely crafted leather goods and intricately carved wooden artifacts produced by the Elk Shadows provided a valuable secondary income, diversifying the ranch's economic base and reducing its sole reliance on crop yields, which remained vulnerable to the unpredictable climate. Conversely, the educational landscape of the ranch also required a dual approach, integrating formal Western schooling with the transmission of indigenous knowledge. Now consider how this applies when you must create an educational system that honors and preserves diverse cultural heritages while equipping individuals for a broader world. While the town's existing schoolhouse provided literacy and numeracy instruction, Jed recognized the immense value in preserving the oral traditions, ecological knowledge, and spiritual practices of the Elk Shadows. He supported the elders in establishing informal learning circles, where younger generations could learn about their ancestral stories, their understanding of the constellations, and their deep connection to the land. This dual curriculum ensured that the children were not only equipped with the skills necessary to navigate the wider Western society, but were also grounded in their own rich cultural identity, fostering a sense of pride and continuity that transcended the animosities of the past. Another crucial layer to this ongoing integration was the development of a shared spiritual and ceremonial life. Now, consider how this applies when you must foster mutual respect and understanding between people with different belief systems. While Jed's family had a history rooted in a more conventional, though often pragmatically applied, faith, the Elk Shadow's spirituality was deeply intertwined with the natural world, revering the land, the animals, and the celestial bodies. Jed facilitated opportunities for shared ceremonies, not in an attempt to homogenize their beliefs, but to create spaces for mutual observation and respect. He witnessed the profound beauty of the Elk Shadow's harvest rituals, their deep reverence for the life-giving properties of water, and their intricate connection to the cycles of nature. By participating even as an observer, he began to understand that spiritual fulfillment could manifest in myriad forms, each holding its own intrinsic value and contributing to the overall well-being of the community. This process of shared spiritual engagement was perhaps the most subtle yet profound aspect of their integration, fostering a deeper, more empathetic understanding that transcended mere coexistence. Reflecting on this journey so far, we can perceive a profound reshaping of foundational beliefs, not through dramatic pronouncements, but through the quiet accumulation of shared experiences. The stark lines that once delineated boundaries, both physical and philosophical, have begun to blur, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of interconnectedness. The very concept of resilience, once defined by a solitary, unyielding defense, has transformed into a collective strength, forged in the crucible of mutual reliance and shared vulnerability. It's akin to observing a landscape gradually shift. The harsh, unyielding rock faces that once defined its contours are slowly softened by the persistent, yet gentle erosion of time and circumstance, revealing a more intricate, interwoven topography. The initial stark dichotomy of us and them has yielded to a spectrum of shared humanity, where individual needs are met within a framework of communal responsibility and where past grievances, though not forgotten, no longer dictate the terms of future interaction. In light of these insights, the path forward, while not yet fully illuminated, becomes discernibly clearer. The integration of disparate practices, once viewed as insurmountable obstacles, has revealed itself as the very source of a renewed vitality. What began as a reluctant accommodation has blossomed into a fertile synergy, where the unique strengths of each tradition have been not merely tolerated, but actively cultivated, leading to a richness and depth that neither could have achieved in isolation. This convergence has fostered a subtle yet powerful transformation in the very essence of community, moving beyond mere coexistence towards a genuine interdependence. It's as if disparate threads, once seemingly disparate and unconnected, have been meticulously woven together, creating a tapestry far stronger and more intricate than the sum of its individual components. The initial fear of scarcity has, through shared ingenuity and a redefinition of abundance, given way to a quiet confidence in the sufficiency of their collective resources and wisdom. As we pivot towards the final reflection, the cumulative effect of these subtle yet significant shifts becomes evident. The initial starkness of survival has been replaced by a more profound understanding of thriving, a concept deeply rooted in empathy and mutual respect. The landscape, both external and internal, has been irrevocably altered, not by a single cataclysmic event, but by the steady, persistent application of principles that prioritize connection over isolation, generosity over scarcity, and understanding over judgment. The echoes of past hardships remain, serving not as monuments to division, but as quiet reminders of the transformative power of choosing a different path. The very air on the ranch seems to carry a different quality now, imbued with the scent of possibility and the quiet hum of a community that has learned to draw strength not from its fortifications, but from its open gates and the shared harvest of its collective spirit. The wind, now a gentle murmur through the mature corn, carries a different song than the one that once whipped across the barren plains. It speaks not of scarcity, but of abundance, not of fear, but of a quiet, hard-won peace. Jedediah Lowell, no longer the solitary sentinel guarding a fortified existence, stands as a testament to a transformation that began not with a grand decree, but with a simple act of shared sustenance. The fences that once defined his world, rigid and unyielding, have dissolved, replaced by the permeable boundaries of a community that understands strength not as isolation, but as the interconnectedness born of mutual respect and shared vulnerability. The land itself, once a testament to struggle, now thrives under a stewardship that honors the wisdom of generations, blending the pragmatic resilience of the West with the deep ecological understanding of the elk shadows. This is not merely a story of survival, but of a profound redefinition of what it means to truly live, to flourish, not in spite of difference, but because of it. The lessons etched into Jed's soul are not those of conquest or dominion, but of the quiet power inherent in choosing compassion when the world screams for retribution. He learned that mercy, far from being a weakness, is the most potent force for healing, capable of mending not only fractured communities, but also the deepest fissures within the human spirit. His mother's sacrifice, once a source of sorrow and unanswered questions, has become a guiding light, her whispered wisdom a constant reminder that true redemption is found not in self-preservation, but in the courageous continuation of love's enduring legacy. The amulet, once a relic of loss, now rests as a symbol of connection, a tangible link between a past of profound separation and a present of interwoven destinies. The laughter of the tavern, once a chorus of derision, has faded into the rustling leaves, a distant echo of a world that failed to grasp the enduring truth that generosity, when sown in fertile ground, yields a harvest far richer than any material wealth. The true practice begins now, not in grand gestures that echo the past, but in the daily quiet affirmation of the values that have reshaped this valley. It is in the shared meals, the intermingled songs, the children who run freely across fields that once represented division. It is in the understanding that the resilience of this land and of its people is not built on walls, but on the willingness to extend a hand, to offer water when the well is low, to kneel when the world expects one to stand tall and alone. The final insight, the enduring truth that permeates this transformed landscape, is that the most profound strength is not found in the weight of a bullet, but in the quiet courage to nurture life, to embrace vulnerability, and to recognize that in the shared act of planting seeds, we cultivate not just sustenance, but the very essence of our humanity, ensuring that the legacy of sacrifice becomes the fertile soil for a future where every soul is welcomed and every hand extended is met with open arms.